of the European Citizens Initiative that invites the Commission to suggest to the European Council to repeal the negotiation mandate on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership and not to conclude the comprehensive economic trade agreement. This sentence I just said was more or less exactly the wording of the subject of our European Citizens Initiative, and we will use the next maybe 20 minutes of the press conference to elaborate and explain on the goals that we have and the method of the European Citizens Initiative. After that, I'll allow to you in the audience and also to all the people on the live stream in the internet to ask questions that we will answer. And to reach our goals, we built a huge alliance with more than 150 organizations from the north and the west and the east and the south of the Union, coming from all different fields of working, such as the environment, international justice and development. The trade unions are on board, some of them. There are organizations caring about consumer protection, about democracy, about civil rights, both offline and online. There are political parties on board and some organizations caring about culture and representing artists. Every European Citizens Initiative needs a citizens committee with 7 people from 7 different countries. 4 of them are present. There are 3 more that are not present, that couldn't make it, which are Lavinia Andrei, representing Terra Millennial 3, an environment organization from Romania. There's Pedro Kropensky from Portugal, representing the organization Oikos, and Blanche Weber from the Mouvement Écologique in Luxembourg. Those 3 couldn't make it. Present, we have Otto Kronqvist, Otto get up, from the TTIP Info Network in Finland. There is John Hillary, representing War on Want from Great Britain. Michi Effler from More Democracy, Mehr Demokratie e.V. in Germany. And Susan George, representing ATTAC and the Transnational Institute. She lives in France. Furthermore, we have had a preparation committee that worked on the ECI during the last month, and some of the people working on that are here, and they also will be present after the press conference to answer some questions if you want to. Those are Marita Strasser from the organization Campact, Ernst Christoph Stolpe from Friends of the Earth Germany, and Roland Süß from ATTAC. So, my name is Karl Beer. I represent the Munich Environment Institute, and I will shortly explain the way we will allow questions posted on the internet. On our homepage, www.stop-ttip.org, we have a live chat system, and all the questions that are posted on this homepage will be collected by Lisa Albers, who then will input them into our press conference. That gives the possibility to people who are not actually present to take part. Well, I will now give the floor to Susan George.
Very much, Carl. And I'm delighted to be here and to be representing ATTAC France and the Transnational Institute here with my colleagues. I've been asked to give you a kind of short history of trade agreements for quite a while back, let's say 20 years. And let me say that the transnational corporations have been present ever since we can start with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization. They have been at the heart of the action, and the GATS in particular was added to the Uruguay round, which ended up creating the WTO. Here is what the director of services at the European Union said about the services agreement, without the enormous pressures exerted by the American financial sector, particularly companies like American Express and Citicorp, there would have been no GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services, and therefore perhaps no Uruguay round and no WTO. The United States fought to get services on the agenda, and they were right. So that's from the inside, someone saying how present the transnational corporations were at that time. The WTO has continued, however, meanwhile, another agreement was being negotiated in secret, which was the multilateral agreement on investment, which we discovered in about 1997 had been started at the OECD in secret in 1995, therefore just 1 year after the WTO began operating. And the multilateral agreement on investment already included the investor-to-state dispute resolution mechanism, which as soon as people heard about it, that companies would be able to sue sovereign states if the companies thought that any action of a government, any measure passed by a government, could harm their present or even future anticipated profits. And once people heard about that, they became virulently against the MAI, and the result was that in France we had a very good campaign, and we happened to have a socialist government at the time, and France, under pressure, withdrew and the agreement collapsed. But that was a milestone, and it shows that people can win when they come together to defeat a measure which is clearly egregiously biased in favor of transnational corporations. Meanwhile, at the WTO, they had started the Doha round in 2001, but the Doha round got very much bogged down. And consequently, a lot of countries were out there looking for an advancement of different sections of the WTO. And what they found was that they could conclude bilateral trade and investment agreements with a whole range of countries, to the point that today there are about 3,500 trade and investment agreements, and every member of the European Union, according to Pascal Lamy, is involved on average in 13 different trade and investment treaties, aside from their membership of the European Union and negotiating as a whole inside the European Union. After this barrage of negotiations on BITs, as they're called, bilateral investment trade treaties, we came into the era of the mega treaties, which have been mostly initiated by the United States, sometimes by Europe, but mostly by the United States. And now the US, as you undoubtedly know, is negotiating both the Pacific Treaty Agreement and the TTIP, of course, the TAFTA or TTIP. This is very interesting from a geopolitical point of view, because the US is in the middle, and if they could get both the Pacific and the Atlantic agreements signed, that would represent literally about 2/3 of GDP in the world and about 3/4 of all trade. So since China, India, Brazil, and all the other BRICS would be excluded because they are nowhere in this configuration, it would be very likely that if both of these were signed and that there was that amount of power behind those agreements, they would have to give in. The BRICS would have to give in and say, okay, we will accept all of the regulations that you have negotiated for the Pacific and the Atlantic agreements. And that would really put the United States in the middle of a very extraordinary power configuration. I just wanted to mention that in passing. Also, meanwhile, that all of this was going on politically, a great deal was going on in the world of the transnationals, beginning with the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, founded in 1995, which is a collection, it still exists, it's a collection of about 70 major transnational corporations from both sides of the Atlantic, and they have a quite extraordinary slogan. You may judge for yourselves. I find it a bit pretentious, but the slogan is approved once, accepted everywhere. In other words, if we approve it, we the transnationals from both sides of the Atlantic, then everyone else should just accept it. Please be quiet. We have accepted. It should be accepted everywhere. What is this transatlantic business dialogue? Well, I will quote their site, which says it was convened in 1995 by the US Department of Commerce and the European Commission to serve as the official, I underline official, dialogue between American and European business leaders and US cabinet secretaries and EU commissioners. So for the first time, you have a body of transnational corporations that is given an official political standing. And as the European Commission explained in the year 2000, and I quote, "In line with transatlantic business dialogue recommendations, we have made particular efforts in the field of standards, certification, and regulatory issues." So you can see that 15 years later, that's still the terrain that they are on. They are accepting the recommendations of the transnational corporations, which have been designated to run European trade and investment policy. The main lobbies that are pushing for this, and they all have multiple memberships, so one can be a member of the US Chamber of Commerce, but also of many other organizations. The same thing is true for the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which is about 50 corporation presidents of huge European companies, which are also members of Business Europe and many other organizations. But they are the major people who are meeting with the Commission constantly, have a great deal of say on the agenda, are intimately acquainted with the content and the progress of the negotiations. And I understand that we have a guest today who is from the Transatlantic Business Council. Welcome, if that's the case. You know a great deal more than we do about the content and the progress of these negotiations, so I'm sure we can learn a great deal from you, Mr. Bennett, and your colleagues, if you are here. I have just enough time, I think, to say that we've also had a proliferation of other organizations. From January 2013, there is also something confusingly called the Transatlantic Business Council, which incorporates the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. I just saluted the head of that. And we also have, formed by Angela Merkel, George Bush, and Mr. Barroso in 2007, a Transatlantic Economic Council. So there are a lot of acronyms and a lot of confusing organizations that are all pushing for exactly the same things. If you are called a stakeholder, that's because the transnationals have accepted you. I don't think any of us here at this table can be considered stakeholders. We may be citizens, but that doesn't give us any rights, and my colleagues will be telling you about the secrecy, about many other negative factors. There is, yes, okay, I will finish. I don't think that there is anything that can be done to improve the TTIP. I think we simply have to say we will not sit down at that table, and no number of exceptions or getting rid of the investor to state will get rid of this. We have, I'm sorry, very sorry, that's my phone, which never rings, and I thought I'd turned it off. But I'll finish there, because then you can listen to my colleagues, and I can maybe find my phone in this mess and turn it off. And I'll play itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. for this insight about the past and the present. I'll now give the floor to John Hillary.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you for inviting me here today. My name is John Hillary. I'm the executive director of an organization from the UK called War on Want, which has been fighting for global justice for the last 60 years. It was founded in 1951. Personally, I have been engaged with trade policy issues for the last 20 years, following all of the campaigns that Susan has just talked about. And I am the author of the booklet on TTIP, which is published by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation here in Brussels and is available in 7 European languages, should you wish to compare the translations on their website. I'm very glad to be able to speak here as one of the members of the Citizens Committee for the European Citizens Initiative on CETA and TTIP. And I want to focus on 2 of the 3 main pillars of TTIP. If you remember, TTIP has 3 main pillars. The first of this is a deregulation. The second of this is a spreading of the private sector into more and more public markets. And the third is the investor protection, which Susan's talked about a little bit, but I know Michael is going to talk about next. So I'm going to focus on deregulation and the public services issue. First, deregulation. We know that deregulation is at the heart of TTIP. The European Commission and the US government have made completely clear that they see all of the major gains from TTIP coming out of a deregulation, a removal of regulatory barriers to trade. Why? Because the tariff barriers between the European Union and the USA are already at minimal levels, so you won't get very much just by removing tariff barriers as you used to do in the traditional trade agreements. TTIP is a new generation, 21st century trade and investment agreement which aims not at the border, at tariffs, but behind the border, into the regulatory space that we inhabit. And this is particularly dangerous for those of us who are European citizens, because our standards on food safety, our standards on environmental protection, and our standards on labor rights are far higher than the standards that pertain in the United States of America. To give you just a couple of examples of this, in the USA, 70% of all food, processed food, which is sold in supermarkets, contains genetically modified ingredients. 70% of all food sold in US supermarkets contains GMOs. Whereas in Europe, we have very, very strict regulations and a ban on that. And if they contain any GM ingredients down the supply chain, then they have to be clearly labeled. Similarly, we have very important pesticide regulations in Europe, which prevent 40% of all food being exported from the US into the European Union. You know about all of the scandals in terms of chlorine chicken and beef, which is produced by growth hormones. Again, 90% of all beef produced in the USA is produced with growth hormones, which means the cows grow quicker and therefore cost less money and therefore are more profit heavy, if you wish. These are banned in the European Union because they're carcinogenic. And the whole point about TTIP is to remove the regulations, the standards that we hold dear, because they are barriers to the maximization of profit by companies trading and investing across the Atlantic. And chemicals is another important sector to look at, because the chemicals industry in the European Union is required to meet far higher standards than in the USA. Why? Because the precautionary principle is enshrined at the heart of the European Union's regulations. The precautionary principle says you, as a business, cannot introduce a harmful chemical into commercial use unless you have proved, you, the business, have proved that it is absolutely safe. And that was the conclusion of the 2007 REACH regulations introduced here. The opposite pertains in the United States. Unless the government can prove that a chemical is unsafe, then business is allowed to introduce it commercially. And that type of difference is exactly what they want to move away from through the TTIP talks. They've made this quite clear. And if they can't do it immediately, they want to set up what they call as a regulatory cooperation council, which will give US corporations the power in the future to be in at the very beginning of the launch of new regulations and directives in Europe. So they get the right to lobby and the right to prior knowledge of any new regulations that come in. So the deregulation agenda at the absolute center of TTIP is incredibly dangerous. The second aspect that I want to touch on is the issue of public services. We know that the European Union has put on the table for negotiation in TTIP health services, education services, postal services, wastewater services, and many other public services which are already in mixed delivery between the private sector and the public sector. We have the leaked draft EU services offer, which states very clearly that these services are included in TTIP negotiations. The only sector which is not included, of course, is the audiovisual sector, because the French said that they would not allow TTIP to proceed with audiovisuals included in it. And we're saying, along with trade unions and millions of other people across Europe, that we do not wish to see our public services traded away. And you may have seen in the press in the last week in my country, in the UK, a spin operation where a supposedly private letter between Ignacio Garcia Becerro, the lead negotiator on TTIP for the European Commission, and the British politician who is pushing TTIP through the British Parliament, John Healey, this so-called private letter was leaked to The Guardian and the Financial Times, who both printed it as if it was true and said that this is a justification of the European Commission position. I was also trained as a journalist. I was trained at the BBC, and we were told, you need to check the sources that you get. You need to confirm. You don't need to just reproduce press statements and letters which have come from the public bodies which are meant to represent us. So this is completely a spin operation which has been put in place. And why? Because the European Commission knows that the people of Europe do not wish to see their public services traded away simply for corporate profit. So I will conclude there. I'm very, very pleased to be one of the Citizens Committee for the European Citizens Initiative. We stand against TTIP. We stand against the ratification of CETA. And I invite any more questions afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Michael Effler. I'm the national spokesperson of Mehr Demokratie, a German democracy NGO, More Democracy, if you want. And it's very untypical for us to enter a trade or investment debate. That's not our issue in normal circumstances. But as we've entered this debate on TTIP and CETA, we analyze that both negotiations and both agreements are a threat to democracy and also to the principle of the rule of law. And I will try to explain that a little bit more in detail while we view this. First of all, you all know that all these negotiations are very secret. We have a negotiating mandate that is not published, so the whole direction of the negotiations is hidden from the public. No negotiating texts have been released so far to the public, and even some submissions from the US to the European Commission will not be published to the general audience, will only be published to the Commission and not even to the parliaments or to the member states. And this is really pre-democratic in the 21st century, is absolutely unacceptable. But it's not only a question of procedural flaws, it's also a question of substantial problems that we have with these negotiations. And we'll talk about one of the, I think, most controversial issues in both agreements. This is the investment part of both agreements. You know, TTIP and CETA should contain investment protection rules that would be enforced by a mechanism called ISDS. This means investor-to-state dispute settlement. And I think we all agree that this is not necessary, but on the other hand, it's dangerous. It's not necessary because the US and the European Union has an established legal system. There is a rule of law, and we have no systematic problems with access to justice and with fair process in the courts. We have no reports of systematic discrimination of foreign investors in the US or in the European Union. Last week, I was at a conference in Berlin, and I talked to a guy from an employers organization, and he said to me in private that he asked all his members, small and medium enterprises, hey friends, can you report any evidence of discrimination or of expropriation or unfair discrimination in the US? And no one replied. No one from this whole big employers organization replied and reported that they have some problems in the US. Also, we have big investment flows from the EU to the US and from the US to the European Union. There is a study from the London School of Economics, very pro-free trade, I think a pro-investment group, and they said there will be no significant positive impact of a TTIP investment chapter. So it's not necessary, but on the other hand, it's dangerous. ISDS is dangerous because it will circumvent public courts. It would lead to a parallel judicial system exclusively available for foreign investors, not available for states to sue companies, not available for small and medium companies, not available for investors from the country, from the host country of an investment. And experience on ISDS in the last years shows that it was in the beginning used as a protection against physical taking of property or clear discrimination of operating of investments or investors, but now it's frequently used to attack laws and regulations that have been adopted in the public interest, so-called indirect expropriations or regulatory takings. And this is a new development. You can say it was created as a shield, to protection, a defense mechanism, but now it's a sword. It's an attacking mechanism, and this is a big danger for regulations. And what is being attacked? The ban of chemicals, the annulation of even useless patents, tobacco rulings, laws that banned nuclear power plants, and so on and so on. And we have a lot of flawed decisions. For example, only one example to give you, in Libya, an investor from Kuwait invested $5 million in a tourism project, and the Libyan state entered into it and said, okay, no, you could no longer do that. And then this investor claimed or sued Libya for an ISDS arbitration tribunal, and the ruling was that the investor should be compensated with $935 million for lost future profits for 83 years. This is, of course, an extreme example, but this shows how flawed the process can be. And if we allow ISDS within a TTIP deal, then we have 75,000 potential new claimants on both sides of the Atlantic, because 75,000 enterprises roughly estimate has foreign investment in the US or in the EU. And this is unacceptable from a democratic point of view, and that's why so many citizens in a whole lot of countries in Europe are really concerned, and we will fight that. So I'm very proud and happy today that we can announce this European Citizens Initiative. I'm proud also to belong to the Citizens Committee. Carl also presented the text of the ECI. Just to bear it in mind, we have a very clear message. We want to stop TTIP. We want CETA not to be ratified. I hope this would lead to a strong and clear campaign. We will continuously broaden our alliance. We have 150 organizations, so we will I'm absolutely sure we will get much more in the upcoming weeks and months from UK, from France, from Britain, from Germany, from Eastern Europe, from Finland, and from other countries. The next step is today we have requested a registration at it works online in a formula by the European Commission, and the European Commission has to decide within 2 months whether this request is admissible or not. We are very disappointed with the Commission because we asked them end of May for a legal pre-check of our ECI, and they didn't reply to us. And that's really a bad form of administration, but we are quite sure that our ECI is admissible. You always also find a legal opinion of a law professor in your materials, and we are working, or we are heading towards a European competence. Trade policy and investment policy is a European competence, and as you know, an ECI can only affect European matters, and that is definitely a European matter, so we're very optimistic that this ECI is going to be registered. So, and if it's being registered in 2 months' time or a little bit shorter time frame, then we have the ambitious task to gather 1 million signatures coming from at least 7 member states, and I hope we will do that, and I'm really happy to go into this campaign. Thank you.
Okay. Now we presented our goals and methods, and I would like to ask you to ask questions. Are there any? First you in the second row, and then you back there.
Yes, freelance photographer in Brussels. Is there any, liaison office in Brussels you run? Because as far as I know, it's very, very important to be present here. Because as far as I know, this is national interventions you do, but all those decisions are made here, and the huge lobby is very, very, they push very hard, and I think as long as you're not present here, it takes longer to be able to intervene.
Thank you for the question. You in the back.
Hi, I'm Sally Sharif. I'd like to know what arguments you have against the claims of people who are promoting TTIP, that this agreement will create more jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And creating jobs has become so important to us. Mr. Juncker said recently that creating jobs for the young will be at the top of his agenda. And in the business summit just a month ago, where again TTIP was being discussed, there was a lot of emphasis by all speakers who talked in favor of TTIP that this agreement is our chance of sort of revolutionizing the job market in Europe and creating opportunities that had never existed before. So, and I can understand that for the citizens, this would be a lucrative, let's say, claim that this agreement will create jobs. I'd like to know what arguments you have against it and how you think this claim is not valid if it is not. Thank you.
Okay, we will answer those two first. I got you.
So I will start with the question on the Brussels office. We have no Brussels office, but we have a lot of NGOs who are residing here in Brussels. We have a lot of persons who will help us if it's needed to be present here in Brussels. But we will have a campaigning office in Berlin, but we will have strong contacts here to Brussels and also to other capitals and other cities in Europe.
And just to say as well, you need to maybe distinguish between the European Citizens Initiative and the other work that we're doing on TTIP and CETA, where we have lots and lots of presence in Brussels, finding out what's actually being done behind closed doors and exposing that to the public. But if I may answer the lady in terms of jobs, because this is I've studied very carefully. If you look at the European Commission's own impact assessment, which they commissioned from a British organisation, CEPR, the Centre for Economic Policy Research, last year, this states quite clearly that as a result of TTIP, there will be at least 1 million jobs lost. At least 1 million jobs lost between the European Union and the USA combined. It's very important to have read this. Obviously, they do not promote this as their as their sort of top-line propaganda. But if you look very carefully at the report they commissioned, it's quite clear that there will be a massive loss of jobs. Now, they also say that because of the high levels of unemployment already existing in the European Union and USA, which you refer to quite correctly, they say that it's highly unlikely that all the people who lose their jobs will find new jobs. They recognize that this is a potentially disastrous situation in terms of employment. And that is absolutely consonant with the experience of other free trade agreements. Think of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement launched in 1994 between the USA, Canada, and Mexico. The promises which were given to the US labor unions was for hundreds of thousands of new jobs. And the reality after 12 years is that they had lost over 1 million jobs net. So I think it's really important that when we hear those top-line figures, we then look actually at the detail of what they have in their own reports. This is not our figures, it's the European Commission's own statistics suggest that there will be at a minimum 1 million jobs lost directly as a result of TTIP.
I would just like to add to what John has very properly said, that the quote that they use all the time from the CEPA report, that organization itself, which is funded by a lot of transnational corporations, it's not a neutral body, the think tank that wrote that report. They say themselves that this is their most optimistic view. It is not the middle ground view. And I would just add to the NAFTA story that over 2 million Mexican farmers were immediately ruined because of the corn, the subsidized corn that came pouring into Mexico, and an additional 500,000 are barely making it now and may have failed by now since the time I saw those statistics. And furthermore, a great many industrial jobs were lost in the United States. This is confirmed by the U.S.-Korean trade agreement, where they made exactly the same claims. And immediately they said, well, the balance of trade with Korea will go up, we'll be much better off, and we will add many jobs. And immediately 70,000 jobs were lost, and the balance of trade fell in favor of Korea and against the United States. So jobs and growth is the only thing they have to say. So they're trying to support this argument with any old thing they can find by distorting the facts.
Yeah, my name is Alain Savanti. I was working in the European Commission for many years, but between 1995 and 2000 in the telecom department with the Commissioner Bangeman, who took very active part in the transatlantic business dialogue. There are 3 sectors you've not mentioned and which should be, I think, a question of concern. It's competition. The way competition is working in the States is we are supporting that our companies become the biggest company in the world. We have a different policy here. There was an issue of standards also, where the Americans told us, you don't need to have cell phone standards for roaming because the people are not traveling in Europe. And another issue is data protection. We have a data protection legislation in the EU. They don't have in the States.
Thank you. I'll collect 2 more and then it's, yeah.
Philip Blankenship of Reuters here. I had 2 points to mention, or questions. One, there is, I can see here, there is this estimated time schedule. Obviously, the announcement today relates to the launch of this initiative. Now, clearly, I see there's reference to a website, so I can obviously look and see what the procedure is. But maybe you can expand a little bit on what this citizens' initiative is and aims to do, and what as I say, obviously I can do my research later, but maybe you can kind of just tell us a little bit about what the plan is, because clearly, you're all opposed to TTIP for a variety of reasons, but you're telling us today is you have a particular initiative as opposed to that you're against TTIP, which you presumably were yesterday as well. The other thing is that, I mean, and I'm just going to say, I don't work for the Commission, but I'll put the Commission's hat on and say that, you know, their claim against, you know, people like yourselves is that you're scaremongering, and that you know, not all of the things that you're saying are true. And I'm just going to pick up on one of the things that you said, John, which is about deregulation. I mean, you're quite right, obviously, that the tariffs existing are very low, and that it's looking beyond the borders, and that it's looking at deregulation. But it's maybe not perhaps going quite to the extent that you're suggesting. Just take, for example, hormone treatment of beef, for example. In the case of the CETA deal, and I think you know, the allowance has been related to hormone-free beef. In other words, there's an increased allowance. And you say that the Commission has been quite clear. I mean, the EU side at least has been quite clear that, you know, the food standards will not drop in Europe, and that you know, issue items like, you know, chlorinated chicken or chlorine-treated chicken, hormone-treated beef, you know, these will not be allowed in. In other words, there will be more beef, let's say, coming from the US, but this would be hormone-free beef.
Please give the microphone to the back.
It's more or less the same question. I mean, the Commission says that those standards are not on the negotiating table. Are they just lying, or what is this a misunderstanding, or what is the problem there? And as far as the American standards are concerned, I mean, what's actually wrong with the American standards? I mean, are the Americans dying on a daily basis because they are poisoned, or do they live shorter, or is there any proof that this is a dangerous standard?
Thank you.
Martin Todd, freelance journalist. Can you say what outreach you've made to the new Parliament, the new European Parliament, or what you plan to do to get the support there? Thanks.
I think that's enough for one round.
Michael should talk more about the ECI. I would just say a word that our goal is to practice what we called at the time of the fight against the multilateral agreement on investment, what we called the Dracula strategy. Because if you show people and explain to people what is the actual content of the treaty, it's like exposing the vampire to the sunlight. And the vampire, when it is exposed to sunlight, as you know, shrivels and it dies. And that is, in one word, I'd say that's our strategy. But certainly Michael should say more about that. I would like to reply a little to the scaremongering accusation. It's true that tariffs are low, but they're not low in the agricultural sector. And they're a little bit higher than the average of 2 or 3% in the automotive sector. In agriculture, it's very dangerous for European farmers because our farms are much smaller. We do not have the same level of efficiency. If you put efficiency, if you mean by that a hugely productivist system. We've got a lot of smaller specialty farms, a lot of bio farms, and more every day, because that is what the European consumer is increasingly demanding, much safer and more interesting food. And I think one of the attributes of Europe is that we really do have better I was born in the United States, and we really do have better food than in the US. So I would add that. But there is a danger to small farms. The US now only has 2 million farms for 300 million people. In Europe, we still have 13 million and some, 13.6 or 7, I think. So there really is a threat to European farmers, most of whom are small. There are some mega farms, but there aren't that many. So, well, yes, I did want to add that we know there's going to be a huge offensive on agriculture because 62 American producers or associations, they go from almonds to beef to seeds to every product you can think of, and they have written to their own negotiator And they have said, these are the things we are demanding, and we want you to get them. And it is GMOs, it is completely free exports for corn and soya in particular. They have no patience at all with our regulations. They say this isn't sound science. They want absolute proof. And John underlined that. It's true that we have a precautionary approach. If it's dangerous, you don't do it. They have a litigation approach, which is if there's something wrong with it, we will soon have court cases, and then we can re-regulate if necessary. The only problem is that with what you eat, there are so many interactions in the human body that we'll never be able to say whether GMOs, well, I won't say never, but at present, we certainly cannot say, and we're very far from being able to say, that GMOs are dangerous for human health. But we know that they are dangerous for the environment, and we know that it is absolutely foolhardy to give the three major companies, or four, total power over your seeds. That's too important a resource to give to a monopoly.
Yeah, I'll just I'll leave you, Michael, to talk about the details of the ECI. But certainly, I think to add to what Susan's just said, for you, Philip, you may have seen the recent comments from the US Secretary of Agriculture, which were absolutely clear that all of these issues are on the table for the US side. They are saying, we are coming into these negotiations because we see massive blocks to US agricultural exports into Europe. And that, of course, has long been the motivation for the US to engage in multilateral trade talks as well. That's why they got involved in the Doha round at the WTO, precisely because they were told that this could lead to increased market access for US agricultural exporters. Yes, the Commission is on the back foot. They recognize this is deeply unpopular within Europe, and the statements that Karel de Gucht made some time ago have come back to haunt him, when he said it's going to be a hard battle to get rid of regulations in Europe, but it will be worth it. And he's now finding that that type of statement has not been helpful for selling TTIP to the general public. What they're having to do now is start talking less about regulatory harmonization and more about regulatory coherence. So what they're trying to do is move the language to suggest there could be mutual recognition agreements, like there have been in other treaties, or indeed what they're now calling recognized equivalence, which would mean that maybe, who knows, because we haven't started the negotiations yet properly on this, but maybe it would be possible still to withhold the European Union bans on certain substances produced here. But if you have recognized equivalence for the rules, what you're saying is that you can accept the US standards and their regulatory processes and still have an increase, not just in hormone-free, but in other beef as well. Our concern is that these things shouldn't be on the table, because we, the peoples of Europe, have absolutely nothing to gain and absolutely everything to lose. I've just quickly answer Martin's point about the European Parliament. Absolutely. We're very keen outside of the European Citizens Initiative, but also with it, to approach the European Parliament. In the last days of the previous Parliament, as they were launching the electoral campaigns, we had targeted actions at each of the MEPs, asking them to commit themselves to an alternative set of principles on European trade. And so we asked them to sign up to that. Of the 70 odd from the UK, we had 12 who have now got back in to the Parliament who have signed up to those alternative principles. And so we're going to be following up with them and with others from across Europe who have said that they are prepared to see a new type of trade and investment policy in Europe, particularly those who are within the new Inter-Committee, the Trade Committee of the European Parliament, because we know that they ultimately, if TTIP ever comes to a vote at the European Parliament, which we sincerely hope it will not, if it does, then they will have the power to throw it out.
So there was a question on the ECI procedure itself. As you all know, the ECI was established with the Lisbon Treaty. It's an instrument of participatory democracy. The next steps are, today we requested registration. The Commission has to answer within 2 months on it. If it's registered, then we have 1 year time to gather at least 1 million signatures coming from 1/4 of the member states. We have the possibility to gather online and offline, and we will take all measures to fulfill this goal. And after that, it's presented to the European Commission again, and the European Commission has the obligation to make a hearing with the organizers of the ECI in the European Parliament. The hearings on right to water on one of us, and the next one is or was, I'm not quite sure, on the stop vivisection, where rarely there were a lot of people there, 100 MEPs, for example, at the right to water hearing. And that's also, even if the parliament is not to be addressed directly by the ECI, of course, if we manage to get 1 million signatures and hopefully a little bit more, then it would make some difference, especially to the parliament. Maybe not that big to the commission, I guess, but we will see. I think the ECI is, apart from these formal possibilities, a good opportunity to raise awareness for this topic. For example, or especially in countries where there's not a big debate now, like it is, for example, in Germany. We go to countries like Romania, Portugal, and there will new alliances because of the ECI on TTIP. And I think this is a good opportunity to bring the resistance against these agreements further on.
Now, Lisa, do we have questions coming in online?
Yeah, there are.
Okay. I saw you, and I know who has the microphone, so we'll do one round online and then we go on offline again.
So there's one question why TTIP is an agreement that generates such a huge backlash. Why were previous agreements discussed in the way that we now discuss TTIP, and why is there an ECI now on this agreement? And then there's another question why the campaign does not include the TISA agreement. This is also discussed at the moment.
Shall I maybe just answer on the first one, which is a very, very good question as to why suddenly there's a new resurgence of interest in the trade and investment policy. For those of us who've worked on trade and investment for the last 20 years, we know that at the time of the launching of the new WTO round, they tried to do it in Seattle in 1999, and obviously it failed, and they succeeded in 2001 at Doha. That brought together a lot of different groups from the environmental movement, from the trade unions, from the other campaigns groups who were concerned about corporate power. And all of the focus was concentrated on the WTO. In a way, it provided a single focus for all of the different campaigns for a just and equitable trading system across the world. Since then, most of those multilateral negotiations have ploughed into the sand and they've stopped. But instead, the EU and the US have focused on bilateral and regional trade agreements in order to try to create exactly the same outcomes. And they're much more difficult for people to be able to follow all together. If you have EU-Korea, EU-India, EU-Mercosur, and all of the other ones, all of the economic partnership agreements with Africa, yes, our organizations have been able to follow those on a policy level. But in terms of raising a massive campaign, TTIP does the same as the WTO did. Why? Because it concentrates all of the highest ambitions of transnational capital into one place. It concentrates all of the ambitions in terms of government procurement, because government procurement contracts are squarely within TTIP. It also concentrates the investment side and the trade in services and the trade in goods. And explicitly, it targets the standards, the regulations that we hold most dear. That's why people have now come out. And when we do dozens and dozens of public meetings in all of the countries across Europe on TTIP, the reaction from people when they learn about it is outrage, because they see that this is not a traditional trade agreement. This is an assault by capital on the very things that we hold most dear in our societies. And I think that's the reason why people are coming out in such huge numbers against it.
Yeah, I would like to answer the question on TISA. Of course, we discussed the topic of TISA. We are very concerned also with the TISA agreement. It's also negotiations in secret. It's an attempt to attack public services. It's a corporate-driven agenda, like on TTIP and on CETA. But, and John mentioned it already, the EU is negotiating so many trade agreements at the same time and has announced to enter even new negotiations that it's absolutely impossible to cover all of this in one European citizens initiative, even for very pragmatic reason, because we have a character limit of 200 characters for the subject matter of an ECI. So that's why we have such a short sentence, and it was not possible to include more trade agreements. Of course, to say it again, and I think we have to communicate it during the campaign. TISA is also a threat to democracy, to public services. But if we win the battle on TTIP, for example, this will have spillover effects on other agreements. And that's why we also included a short reference in the main objectives text of the ECI, that we are not only against some treaties, we are in favor of having an alternative trade and investment policy in the EU.
Andreas from Interfax Europe. I was wondering, do you not see any benefits at all in gas imports from the US to the EU, for instance, which could help diversify supplies? I'm talking about the export restrictions on LNG, which is a chapter that could be included in TTIP. Thank you.
Yeah, I can answer on this if you wish.
Let's collect a few of them.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I'd just like to come back to the first question. A single contact point in Brussels. Could you help us with that?
Hi, my name is Angelo Di Mambro. I'm an Italian freelance journalist. Maybe I apologize because I was late, but what is the specific problem with CETA?
So to respond in terms of the gas, one of the key areas for the US side is that they give priority in terms of the exports of natural resources, particularly oil and gas, to those countries with which they have a free trade agreement. And so one of the things that the European Union is also trying to do, the Commission and also the member states, is to suggest that by increasing the flow of gas and oil, which they get from the tar sands in Canada, into the European Union will somehow be less dependent on Russian resources for energy, which of course is one of the geostrategic objectives that they have. If you consider that the increased use of fracking and the increased presence of shale gas and the increased transfer of fossil fuels and tar sands and the disastrous environmental consequences of that is a positive thing, then TTIP is for you. If, on the other hand, you want to see a future which is free of fossil fuel dependency and is moving towards renewables and other clean forms of energy production, then TTIP is an absolute nightmare. Because what it is suggesting is not just in the US, but also in Europe as well. The bans like they have in France on fracking could immediately be under attack. We've already seen that in Quebec, in Canada, where the ban on fracking in Quebec has been challenged by US company Lone Pine in an ISDS case. So exactly this type of challenge and exactly this type of question, I suppose, is posed by TTIP. Do we want to have a world where we have an increase in the exploitation of natural resources, fossil fuels such as gas and tar sands oil, or do we want to be looking elsewhere and trying to create a cleaner future? On CETA, I'll leave you to do if you want.
Just add one thing to that, which is that there is now a law in the United States which gives total freedom to fracking companies to keep secret the chemicals that they are injecting into wells. And the Pennsylvania Department of Environment is trying to get rid of this because there have been, Pennsylvania is one of the largest fracking sites in the US states. And there are cases where arsenic and other extremely dangerous chemicals are being found in water close by to fracking sites. But since the companies aren't obliged to say which chemicals they are injecting, it's extremely difficult to get any proof. And they can simply say, yes, but Pennsylvania was an industrial state. This could have been their own drilling 50 years ago. This could have been anything, and we are not guilty. But they have this protection. So a lot of the gas, and that's where the U.S. Increase in exports in gas is coming from. It's coming from fracking, and also the tar sands. You're quite right. Aside from the environmental concern in general of having fossil fuel production increase, the idea that we could be forced to allow fracking in Europe and probably under the same standards is rather scary.
So just a quick word on the CETA. It's quite simple because ISDS is included in the CETA agreement, and that's for sure because the investment chapter of CETA was leaked, and it's part of the so-called consultation of the European Commission on ISDS, and so we know that it's an aim to go for it, and that's, at least for our organization, enough to say no to CETA. But there are much more problems, of course, with CETA. I cannot add more to the question on the contact point in Brussels. That, as we said before, we have supporting organizations in Brussels. We will have people working here also for the ECI and outside the ECI on trade and investment issues. And if we need help here in Brussels, we will manage to organize that.
So we can do another round of online questions, if there are any.
So there's one question which asks why there's actually not a European referendum on TTIP, as it concerns so many people here in the EU. And then there's another question regarding the effects of TTIP on developing countries, and if those possibly negative implications are also taken into account by the ECI campaign.
On the referendum, very quick, there is no referendum possibility in the European Union. That's what we fight for a couple of years, but we didn't manage it now. And the most far-reaching formal instrument of influencing European politics is the European Citizens' Initiative, and that's why we choose to use this instrument.
And on the impacts on countries which are beyond the European Union and the US, Susan mentioned this earlier. I mean, it's very much part of the geopolitical reason for going for this transatlantic customs union and more, that they want to try to marginalize the emerging economies of the BRICS and others. So it's very much part of the plan to try to marginalize those emerging economies and their prospects in terms of trade in the future. But the studies which have been done already into the likely effects of TTIP on developing countries have all shown that it's going to be negative. Basically, that the studies show there's a displacement of trade. As you have an increase in transatlantic trade, so you have a displacement and a dislocation of trade from the global south. I have various references to those studies, if you wish, in the booklet which I wrote earlier.
Just add that Hillary Clinton, while she was still Secretary of State, said about the TTIP, this is a strategic just as much as an economic agreement. And by strategic, I think she meant exactly what John has just said.
For a second question and a third, please. So the first one concerns Eastern Europe, and in the initiative on the Wasserinitiative, Wasser für alle, there were many MEPs present, etc. But the votes that were collected, the almost 1 million something votes that were collected, mainly came from 7 of the Western European countries. And at the hearing in the parliament, there weren't many Eastern Europeans present. You could simply see that with the number of headphones put on while German was being spoken. So most of the people attending, the young people attending, were German or French or British, etc. So I'd like to know what is being done to include the Eastern European countries in this initiative, and are we taking concrete steps to explain to the people, let's say in Hungary and Romania, what effects TTIP will have on their industries and on their agriculture? Because this seems to be, a Western European hack that goes around between Germany, France, and Belgium, and nobody else cares about it in the other 25 EU countries. The second question is, I'd like to know if foreign policy has been focused on. One of the reasons we don't want to depend on Russia's gas and oil is that we want to be able to sanction Russia without having our economy suffer from it. Now, if we depend on the gas and oil of the US, it means our foreign policy would have to be influenced by the American criteria. When Barack Obama was here for the EU-US summit at the council, he said the American and the European people share common values. No, we don't. We are against capital punishment. We don't share the same common values anymore. We have chosen our own way, let's say. And if our economies come to be bound together so closely that in every step we would have to go the way of the Americans, I'm not sure that's what we want to happen. Thank you.
So I will start with the question on Eastern Europe. It's a task for us to internationalize as closely as possible the whole campaign. We have already a lot of supporting organizations from Romania. We have one lady from Romania is a member of the Citizens Committee, Lavinia Andrei, and we will go to Romania in August for a session. There's a big gold mine project in Romania. Canadian corporation is included. It's a big issue there, and we try to focus on that. And also we will have a speakers tour in autumn in Romania and maybe in other Eastern European countries, and we will do much more to find supporters and organizations in that countries also. And I'm quite optimistic that we will be a little bit better than Right to Water concerning Eastern Europe.
And just to add, I mean, in the 2-day strategy meeting, which we are all here in Brussels for as well, there are representatives from Poland and Hungary who are very much part of the European movement against TTIP and against CETA. But I just wanted to agree with you entirely about what you said about linking our foreign policy so closely with that of the USA. There is a fundamental problem for the European Union. It is a continent which has almost no natural resources of any use for the future. We're already dependent upon 85–90% for oil and gas imports. Rare earths, we produce none. The important metals for high-tech industry, we produce none. So Europe is a dwindling continent in that, with an aging population and a dwindling productivity capacity. So that is the crisis for Europe as a long-term crisis. Simply hitching our wagon to the United States is absolutely unacceptable, as you say. And it's not just in relation to oil and gas from Russia, it's also in terms of the Middle East. And we're seeing, as we speak, the murderous assault on the people of Gaza as a result of our Middle Eastern energy needs. So, I completely agree with you that there's no easy out for Europe just saying, fantastic, we can get cheap shale gas from the United States, all is good.
Can I just add that on the common values side, there are common values between the transnational corporations of Europe and of the United States. And I remind you of the slogan of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which was agreed once by us, the TNCs, accepted everywhere. This is just considered as automatic. Citizens have absolutely nothing to do with this, and this is not a discussion about what citizens want at all. It's a discussion about what the transnationals have already agreed on through all of the mechanisms that have existed for up to 20 years.
do we have any more questions in the audience? I don't see any. Do we have any more questions in the internet? No. So what we do have is a bakery. And I'd invite you to stay a little. There are, as I said in the beginning, not only the 5 of us sitting on the table, but also the 4 sitting in the front line, able to answer more questions in detail and private. I'd welcome you to stay a little longer. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching in the internet. And all of you, please sign the European Citizens Initiative once it's out.